Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review. In today's video I'm going to review Null by Ken Mode. The experimental noise rock and post-hardcore outfit is back with their brand new album. After being for almost 2 decades in the scene, it is with their previous album, which came out 4 years ago, Loved, in which they gained a bit of a more popularity, and it was certainly one of the most intriguing and one of the most refreshing releases of this year. It was a pretty wacky record to say the least, going into many different phases and directions of like noise rock with post-hardcore and also sludge metal, and also combining it with some really weird and out there jazzy elements and industrial passages. It was all over the place. It was certainly a pretty chaotic album that did its job on just managing to be this really wacky experience. So in this regard I believe that Loved was certainly a pretty intriguing album. What we see with Null is an album that goes into many similar directions but tones it down a little bit, just not being that much out there or insane with the directions that it takes with its sound. It's certainly a much less chaotic album and one that is much more straightforward, and I would say that in this regard it actually works in its favor with Null over here. I find it beneficial for Null to being that much more straightforward, because even though I really like Loved as an album, it was certainly pretty inconsistent at times and becoming so chaotic to the point where it didn't really feel like that much of a compelling experience to fully digest, which is less of the case over here with Null being an album that feels much more cohesive and much more consistent. And it also helps that in terms of instrumentation, musicianship and performances, this album is pretty spot on. And what we get with Null is easily one of my favorite releases out of this year. This is a quite brutal album with intense instrumentation, really nice ideas throughout, a few wacky and out there moments that work pretty well over here, not really being that much insane or really taking that much out of the experience, and just an album that is consistently brutal and punishing from start to finish. It is a pretty intense album, and in my opinion it's executed really nicely in this regard. We have the very first track, A Love Letter, which instantly was amazing in my opinion. I love the punch out of this track, the intensity, the melodies are really solid, and we also get those more experimental jazzy elements with those saxophone parts that sound pretty awesome. There is something eerie and haunting about them just for how off-putting they sound in the mix. It is a really nice addition that certainly gives a refreshing tone, and with this particular song they're also included in a way that adds in the melodic aspects, not just being this really wacky portion out of the song, but a moment that certainly adds to the experience. It is a pretty heavy song, I like its pacing, I like its structure, I think that it's certainly one of the strongest and one of the most solid moments out of the project. Then we go into a bit of a faster pace with the next track, Throw Your Phone in the River. This is an even more straightforward moment in the album. In its instrumentation there's not something really that much out there, but it's also a really short moment going for only 2 minutes, and in my opinion it doesn't really do that much with its runtime. It is a track that is simply solid and it's done pretty well, but this is certainly one of the least impactful moments in the album in my opinion. The very next track, The Tie, is a really nice change of pace. We get this noisy industrial sort of interlude track which is pretty insane. I especially like the vocals out of this one and how they complement the overall instrumentation, which is pretty minimal. It is intense, ferocious, not necessarily one of the best moments in the album, but certainly one of the most unique and intriguing ones out of the album, one that certainly leaves an impact and grabs your attention. This transitions nicely into the very next track, But They Respect My Tactics. One of the tracks that goes into sort of the more post-hardcore directions into their sound, and it's done really nicely. I love the melodies out of this one. I believe that it's a pretty well executed song and one of my personal highlights out of the album. A really solid work over there. And then we go into the next track, Not My Fault, which for me at this point it does sort of similar things that we've heard before with the album. So this one didn't really have something that much particularly more interesting or unique to it. I believe that some of the melodies towards the beginning are pretty solid. It is another track that manages to be pretty intense, but after a certain point it kinda lost its momentum in my opinion. It wasn't one of the most memorable moments in the album for me. Then we have the sludge metal moment out of the album with a 10-minute track, Lost Creep. And actually this one is pretty awesome. One of my favorite moments out of the album, one that starts really slow. It takes a while to really pick up the pace, but I like the overall build up out of this track. I like how we would get those nasty guitars, those sort of militaristic beats, and then we would have those more subtle piano portions which would give a really nice addition to the song. But then we get to the second half where it really picks up and it contains some really nice melodies. It sounds really brutal. It also contains some of my favorite vocal directions out of this project. I like some of the passages that it takes, and overall, even if we're talking about a pretty lengthy track over here, it just passes off pretty nicely, and I really love the execution out of this one. Not necessarily one of the most imaginative tracks out of the album, but it certainly has some of the most solid melodic parts out of this whole project. Then we go into a much faster paced track with The Desperate Search for an Enemy. This for me shares many elements with like the previous songs, and at this point we're pretty much familiar on what the album is going for. And for me, this track didn't really provide that much more. It didn't really feel like that much of a necessity, and for me it was possibly the most underwhelming moment out of the album. Even though we get a solo saxophone portion towards the end of the song, I don't really believe that it added all that much to the experience. Instead, I would say that in this particular case, it didn't really feel all that well, it came out of nowhere, and so yeah, for me not the most properly well executed song. But finally we have what is arguably the most intense and the most refreshing moment out of this whole project, with the track Unresponsive. In this one we actually get a track that goes into directions of like no wave. It is really similar to some of the very first stuff that you would hear out of Swans. It has this really similar vibe, especially with this more industrial drumming, which sounds awesome over here. This track certainly has the greatest drums out of this whole project. They sound really intense and cool, and this overall track, it's just so brutal and so punishing. It is really intense, and I just like how ferocious it is with its vocals, with its overall instrumentation. It is a really devastating and heavy song, a really nice way to end this album, with certainly one of the coolest and most intriguing moments over here. So for me, Null is a consistently great album. Even though it tones it down in terms of experimentation, it makes for an album that is much more straightforward, straight to the point, and it works really well over here. The instrumentation, the ideas, the performances are really on point. One of my highest recommendations out of this year. I believe that this album is pretty solid from start to finish, some really cool ideas over here, and yeah, really digging this brand new album of Ken Mode. I'm gonna give Null an 8- out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why? And what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.